A reporter who is renowned for revealing the harsh realities of the world encounters an unforeseen obstacle when he crosses. Nobody anticipated what would happen next when they cross paths with Keanu Reeves. Talk transforms everything. Are you prepared to see the transformative power of kindness? It was a calm morning in the middle of New York City, and simple acts of empathy may have a huge impact. The actor Keanu Reeves, who is renowned for his peaceful humility, walked through the busy streets in his typical modest presence that the onlookers hardly noticed, but something in the middle of the crowd drew his attention a little. Keane passed the window of the bustling cafe, which appeared to be the scene of a contentious debate, and saw a well-known someone, a journalist renowned for his contentious views, arguing. Today, journalist Mark Carter was the kind of person who thrived on stirring things up among a gathering of people. When he squared up against a group of naive young writers, defending his position on the reality of celebrity culture, his voice was. These performers live in a bubble of noise, and the things he said were cruel. Luxury while the rest of the world suffers, Keanu stated with a sneer and a condescending expression. His first impulse was to continue walking as he had, but he hesitated for a while, interested as ever about the world around him. Several times in the past, when he was treated with criticism or contempt, yet something in the talk kept bugging him, he returned and entered the cafe. Mark's words interrupted the quiet conversation and clatter of coffee mugs. Keanu was smarter than ever throughout it all, and instead of making an announcement, he just sat at the counter, placed his coffee order, and waited while the voice of the journalist reverberated around him. Returning to the contentious discussion, Mark's remarks became more acerbic and the atmosphere in. How long do these celebrities believe they can ignore the world's problems? The room began to rise. Keanu's composed manner persisted as Mark questioned, his gaze sweeping the room as though daring someone to disagree. Unchanged, but he became nervous at that moment due to the language in Mark's speech. Mark glanced directly at. He didn't initially recognize Keanu, but he soon realized that he was a well-known figure. Mark scoffed, his tone now pointed straight at you. What about you, someone who had it all? How many people have you truly impacted at Keanu? How many times have you used? Keanu gradually changed his focus from getting money to using his fame for something worthwhile. Is that what you truly believe? He inquired, his voice, with his face as composed as ever. Mark's eyes briefly expanded as he realized who he was, low but steady. There was a brief pause in conversation as some heads turned to look at the room. Before Mark smirked to hide his shame, there was an awkward moment. I didn't realize you were. Even though I sit here, Mr. Reeves, it doesn't alter the reality that there are a lot of people in this world who are just concerned with. Keanu didn't flinch when he snapped at them, instead, his eyes were. He spoke calmly and softly, and I believe you misunderstood him when he claimed it wasn't concerning fame or wealth, it's about making the most of what you have, regardless of who you are. An odd stillness pervaded the. Mark laughed as the weight of Keanu's remarks hung in the room, yet it was an vacuous laugh, and he was aware of the change and the underlying tension that was growing. Despite his reserved demeanor, Keanu wasn't one to back down from a task, but what would happen next was the question. After hearing the argument, the young writer at the table then spoke out. You both make good arguments about being anxious, but I believe the issue is that people frequently forget that fame comes with responsibility. Mark glared at him, but Keanu turned to face the young author and nodded. It's not. Keanu mentioned quietly that a title or label is about action, and occasionally, the smallest things sometimes have the greatest impact. Mark turned his head away, obviously not wishing to acknowledge that Keanu might be right, but his uneasiness was evident in the cafe. As the audience waited to see what would happen, the atmosphere hummed with soft whispers. The dynamic had changed. The journalist was no longer in charge of the room, and there was a sense of discomfort in the air. Mark was ready to reply when Keanu got up and glanced at him while holding his coffee cup. With a final contemplative glance into the journalist's eyes, "You might wish to reconsider your..." Mark hesitated as Keanu spoke, his voice carrying an underlying depth. Keanu left the cafe behind and turned to head for the door without saying anything more, but as he stepped outside, the gravity of the situation persisted. It wasn't only a dispute, rather, it was a moment that made everyone in the room consider their own opinions and behavior. The day's story wasn't finished yet. In a short but impactful exchange, Keanu Reeves had made an impression, but the true. Would Mark alter his strategy, and would anyone else in the room start to doubt their own convictions? The diner fell silent once more, but Keanu's remarks were only starting to have an impact. Keanu Reeves was strolling down the same street the next day, his thoughts still recollecting his. He hadn't anticipated that his little interaction with Mark would have such an impact with only a few words, but there was. There was something strange about Mark's demeanor that caused Keanu to consider the more profound significance of the. Keanu didn't want to confront him again after their chat, but he couldn't get rid of the sensation that their unresolved matter. Keanu saw Mark seated at the cafe as he passed it. This time, Mark looked different as he scrawled frantically into a notebook at the table. There was a noticeable sense of irritation and anxiety about Keanu, but his curiosity won out of him, and he chose to approach it in a way that wasn't about establishing a point or winning a debate, but rather about. Knowing this, Keanu carefully drew out a chair and took a seat across from Mark. The reporter didn't glance up right away. Despite the tiny tremor in his hand, Keanu's pen continued to move. As usual, Keanu started off calmly, but sometimes the hardest things aren't. Mark initially remained silent at hearing the facts, but after he put down his pen for a few seconds and looked up, his eyes nearly worn out. Mark said in a stern tone, "I'm not interested in listening to lectures from someone like you, but there." Did Keanu's comments suddenly have an undercurrent of vulnerability that wasn't there before? Examined him briefly, focusing on the hard exterior and cynical mask that Mark had on. Yesterday with pride, but today it appeared to be broken. There was something more profound. Keanu could see something bothering him beyond the walls Mark had constructed. "So you can ignore what I said," Keanu kept reclining in his chair, "yet you are aware of the reality just as I am." Has a way of sticking around even when we try to dismiss it. Mark shook his head and laughed bitterly, saying, "The truth is that he scoffed at you. You don't understand what it's like to fight every day just to survive in this world, even though you believe you have the solution. Living in a bubble where everything is given to you makes it simple to discuss kindness when you've never had to deal with conflict." For some reason, Keanu's face softened and his eyes never left any marks. Keanu said, "I don't know," with no wrath in his eyes, only a knowledge that you're right. "I understand what it's like to struggle for survival every day, but I also understand what it's like to feel like the world doesn't care, has dismissed you, and I understand what it's like to want to change things." The words lingered in the air and, for a brief while, Mark seemed to be struck silent by Keanu's candor. Keanu kept leaning, but there was no defensiveness or rage, just the unvarnished truth. Going a little further, every one of us has challenges of our own, but the difference between those who succeed and those who fail is not their wealth or influence, but rather their openness to new experiences. Beyond their personal experience, Mark's lips parted, but Keanu saw that no words came out. For the first time, Mark's thoughts were spinning, and he wasn't battling to be correct. Was paying attention, but that's the issue, Mark stated after a protracted silence. "I can't just continue acting as though nothing is wrong while I see the world collapsing. There are a lot of issues with it. I've dedicated my professional life to exposing the truth about it, yet it seems like no one is ready to take any action. The world, but it is simply too much." Keanu nodded slowly in comprehension. I understand that Mark's remarks carry a lot of weight, but they don't have. Mark stared at him, and sometimes change starts with one person, one small deed at a time. Expression is still ambiguous, but does it really make a difference? I've been writing for years, and nothing has. People have changed, but they still struggle and suffer, and nobody appears to care. What's the meaning of Keanu's stare? The point is that his voice became even softer, nearly a whisper. Someone can cause a stir. I understand how deeply it impacts you after witnessing the worst, but that doesn't. Don't mean you give up, rather, it means you use what you have to change something, even if it's just one person. You cut him off, and his voice took on a hint of resentment like. Keanu was one individual who made a difference. Rather than flinching, he nodded. Yes, deliberately, like me, like you, like anyone who's prepared to take a stance and declare that my goal is to improve the world gradually. It has nothing to do with fame or power. Is about understanding, generosity, and taking action. It's about being there for. The stillness between them was heavy. Mark, even though it was difficult for a brief period, was clearly moved but still torn, and Keanu could tell that the reporter's thoughts were struggling with. I don't know whether I can undo everything that he's been taught. Mark finally expressed the weight of his. With words full of defeat, Keanu grinned softly and said, "You don't have to change everything at once. Start small, do one nice deed, and observe how it gives you the impression that the world doesn't need another tale of good and wrong." Action. As Mark listened to Keanu's comments in silence, the moment seemed nearly sacred. Keanu was aware that change would take time, but he had sown a seed. It was up to him whether it would sprout or not. The air between them was heavy with unspoken words as Keanu slowly rose up. Before leaving, he stated, "It's up to you to decide what you want to do. It's never too late to make a difference, Mark. You do it today." The cafe's door shut behind him, leaving Mark to sit quietly. The question remained in the back of his mind as he considered everything that had just been said. Would he be able to take that initial step? Mark's heart and the air felt a little heavier, but maybe Keanu's. The following few days were oddly silent for Mark since words had sown the seed for a shift he couldn't ignore. Couldn't get the talk with Keanu out of his head. Each time he attempted to ignore the thoughts, they intruded. Returned with more tenacity than before, his typical jagged edges and cynicism so easily appeared less credible today, as he had previously taken satisfaction in being the voice of reason and the one who revealed the world's ugly aspects. But Keanu's remarks had caused him to question his methods, beliefs, and it was a gloomy Thursday morning, and he was unable to see past the obvious. Mark was lost in thought as he walked to his office, and the typical sounds of the city, the blaring horns, and the sounds of people walking around were muted in. In his mind, he wasn't searching for a solution and wasn't even certain what he was searching for, but his feet mysteriously guided him to a tiny corner without his knowledge. Although he didn't typically attend the cafe, something about it seemed different, as though fate had led him there. When he entered, the warmth embraced him like a hug after a long, chilly day. The cafe felt cramped, with walls lined with bookshelves and mismatched furnishings. Cozy, in sharp contrast to the impersonal, well-polished world of luxury goods. Typically occupied, Mark sat down at the counter and placed an order for coffee, his head still spinning from the discussion. While waiting, Keanu caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of his eye. A woman in her clothes, sitting by herself at a nearby table, glanced. Despite being worn out, her face had an indisputable strength and quiet tenacity as she wrapped her hands around a cup of tea. Marks while gazing off into the distant. His instinct was to turn aside and concentrate on the task at hand, but he was extremely affected by the woman's manner. It seemed as though she was bearing the burden of the world on her shoulders, and Mark now understood something he hadn't completely realized, that up until now, He had been preoccupied with the major injustices of the globe that he had overlooked the minor daily struggles waged by regular people without. After giving it some thought, Mark got up and approached the woman's table, pausing for a. He spoke softly, softer than he meant to, just before saying K. The woman looked up, startled, and her eyes were tired. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer right away, as though she wasn't sure, but there was a glimmer of astonishment in her face. Whether or not to believe the stranger seated across from her, but following a protracted silence, she whispered softly, "I'm fine," but the way her voice cracked revealed the. It's just been a difficult moment, and Mark felt a. He had a weird tug in his chest and wasn't sure why he had come up to her. Perhaps it was the tiredness in her eyes. Perhaps it was a reminder of his own internal conflict, but he felt driven to do more than just acknowledge her suffering. "I understand that times can be difficult," Mark said in a quiet, earnest tone. "I don't understand what you're going through, but I believe that occasionally people forget that we're all simply doing our best to get by." There was a long silence as the woman gazed at him, her eyes moving over his face as though attempting to determine how sincere he was. "My son is in the hospital," she said, her voice hardly more than a whisper, before continuing. "They don't know if he's going to make it," she continued, her hands shaking as she squeezed her cup more tightly. "I don't know what to do." Mark's heart tightened. He had been so preoccupied with his own struggles that he couldn't do anything else. Personal desire to demonstrate to the public that he had never really taken the time to hear those who were silently. He had been oblivious to their suffering, unable to recognize that the stories like these about people who needed assistance and someone to look out for them without thinking about Mark were common in the world. Took out his wallet and gave the woman some cash. This might not be the solution, but despite the emotional strain he felt from the woman's words, he added, "I want you to know that someone cares." Her eyes welled up with tears, and she smiled for the first time, although a feeble one. Nevertheless, she expressed her gratitude in a whisper. Unmistakably, Mark turned to leave a peculiar feeling behind. "Thank you so much." It wasn't pride or fulfillment over him, rather, it was something more profound. The realization that he had given her more than simply money was profound. Something much more significant to her, his focus, his comprehension, and his readiness to arrive that evening while Mark sat in his flat and gazed at the. He found himself reflecting about Keanu's words as he turned to a blank page in his notebook. Begin modestly by performing a single act of kindness, and at that very moment, he realized that it was more important to show up for people even if it wasn't about making big gestures or changing the world overnight. Mark's fingers hung over the keyboard when it was difficult, even when everything seemed to be dark. And he started writing new, honest pieces instead of the caustic ones he was accustomed to. It recognized the hardships of those he had long ignored. He came to the conclusion that the world didn't need any more negativity. More empathy and comprehension were required, and Mark Carter was going to be a part of that transformation. Weeks went by, and Mark kept thinking about. His life had changed in minor but significant ways after that peaceful time in the cafe with the woman, and he began paying more focus on those around him, observing the minute indications of hardship that so many others missed. His writing also changed, with articles that formally highlighted the drawbacks of celebrity culture and social unfairness had a more impartial tone today, but he continued to highlight the problems in the globe, but he wanted to take a different, more considerate, and gentler approach. Interact with his audience to help them understand the humanity in stories he told, but as his work changed, so did his internal struggle, with portions of him still yearning to cling to the rage and fury that had stoked. He understood he couldn't abandon the battle against global injustices during his career. However, he was also unable to disregard the lessons he had learned. The balancing act proved more difficult than he had anticipated. As anticipated, One day Mark was strolling down a busy street when he encountered face with Keanu Reeves. Once more Keanu was outside a low building, sitting on a seat. Bookshop, his hands in his lap, his face composed and intent. Didn't first appear to notice Mark, but something about the situation felt like a clue, so Mark paused for a while, pondering whether to approach him, but he felt less different this time. More outspoken and combative, he approached and stood in front of actor Keanu. Looked up, and a mutual understanding that hadn't existed before emerged when their eyes locked. "Hey Mark. I've been thinking a lot about what you said about kindness and making a difference," yet his voice seems a little uncertain. Distinction. Keanu grinned gently, his eyes gentle and steady. "I'm happy to hear that." Mark sat down and spoke calmly, as though he had been waiting for this time. They sat in silence next to him, feeling a little self-conscious yet strangely reassured by Keanu's presence. For a brief period, you were both observing the busy world around them. "I've been viewing the world incorrectly," and Mark started to break the stillness. "I was so preoccupied with pointing out its flaws that I failed to notice its positive aspects." "People," Keanu nodded gently, his face soft and approachable. "Enmeshed in the negativity that surrounds us, yet occasionally the best method to struggle in order to demonstrate to the world the power of empathy and goodwill. Little things can make a big difference." Mark felt the weight of his own hands as he gazed down at them. "Admittedly, I've dedicated my professional life to exposing individuals and attempting to reveal their true selves to the world, but perhaps I've been concentrating on the wrong things, Keanu, and I've been doing it all wrong." His voice was deliberate, and he leaned back a little. "It's not about exposing people, it's about comprehending both of them in yourself. Once you are able to do so, you begin." Mark was silent for a while as he processed Keanu's remarks, since it seemed like a revelation to see the world in a new way. A revelation that he was unaware he required. The world was not only a place of heroes and villains, but also a place of intricate details of individuals who were merely attempting to give it their all, even when it wasn't. Mark asked in a nearly whispered voice, "Easy, how do you do it? How do you stay?" Keanu's smile was so understanding and compassionate. Grew a little, but it was filled with humility rather than conceit. "I don't always succeed," he replied gently. "I am not perfect, but I strive to keep that in mind." Mark exhaled quietly. Everyone is carrying something, and sometimes just being there for someone is enough. He had devoted so much of his life to battling against the weight of those words. People away while retaining his rage and dissatisfaction, but Keanu's method. "I believe I understand Mark's admiration for his readiness to face the world with compassion." With a faint smile pulling at the corner of his mouth, Mark remarked, "It's not about starting with one person at a time and changing the globe all at once." Keanu nodded, his eyes shining. "With peaceful understanding, change is a gradual process that takes time to manifest. Grand gestures occur when you're prepared to support someone, even in the most modest ways, when you decide to observe them instead of passing judgment on them." As Mark sat there alongside, something inside Keanu clicked. It wasn't about proving himself or winning fights. One of the points was realizing how important it was to support people in whatever way, no matter how tiny. Going to alter the course of history in a single day, but he might begin by altering his own viewpoint as they prepared to depart from Mark. Felt a calmness he hadn't experienced in years, even if the world was still full with hardships and suffering, but it was also brimming with generosity and moments of grace that had the power to transform everything. All it required was a single, modest act of. Before they left, Keanu gave him one last knowing grin of understanding. He remarked, "Good luck, Mark," in a light but earnest tone. Mark grinned back, sensing the thanks to Keanu, the weight of the past few weeks has settled in, and I believe I'm beginning to understand that. After Mark left, the city appeared a little more cheerful and the people A little more human was sufficient, and for the first time, it wasn't flawless or simple. Mark had long held the belief that minor adjustments could result in something far more significant. Weeks became months, and Carter's life kept changing in unexpected ways as a result of his profession. His perspective on the world and his writing had changed what had been a career. Focused on highlighting the shortcomings of others and generating stories of discord and condemnation, has evolved into an investigation of humanity, empathy, and modest yet impactful deeds of charity. Marx knew. The articles focused on the story of the quiet moments rather than sensationalism or dragging individuals through the mud. Seeing those who were changing things without trying to attract notice, he started writing about those who had encountered difficulties similar to those of the woman in the cafe, and how they managed to rise above them with community love and resiliency rather than fame or fortune. His remarks were now thoughtful, positive, and most significantly, they were no longer abrasive and combative. Struck a chord with his readers one afternoon when Mark was strolling in a park close to his flat and spotted Keanu was reading a book while seated on a bench. There was something about the same serene silence that Mark had grown to identify with him. About Keanu that, in spite of his fame, had always felt so genuine and approachable. He radiated warmth, a rare characteristic, and his demeanor was devoid of arrogance. In a world that frequently seemed chilly, Mark walked carefully towards him, uncertain of whether Keanu would even recognize him, but as soon as he looked up, a smile appeared on his face and his eyes softened. "It's nice to see you again, Mark," he added with a warm yet light voice. Sat down next to Keanu and smiled back, a little sheepishly. "It's been a while. I've been reflecting a lot on what we said." Keanu nodded, maintaining a steady look as he put his book down and posed a simple question with a hint of curiosity in his voice. Mark inhaled deeply as though considering what he was saying before speaking, "And I believe I now understand it's not about making all the changes in the world at once, rather, it's about the little things that the true impact is in the ones that no one else sees." And Keanu's smile widened his. "You're correct, it's simple to become engrossed in trying to make things better simultaneously, but even the slightest acts, like showing up for even when it isn't convenient." Mark gazed down at his hands as though attempting to comprehend the enormity of. "He was suggesting that I've changed the way I write, and I meant as concerned with pointing. I no longer want to point out the shortcomings of others. Instead, I want to share the tales of those who are changing the world on their own. I want to draw attention to the unsung heroes, those whose deeds are more important than their words." That's the type of writing that made most. Keanu's eyes sparkle with silent admiration. "Has the capacity to transform hearts," he claimed, adding that it's the type of writing that leaves an impression on readers long after they've finished reading it. Nodded, his thoughts whirling with the potential he had achieved since that initial chat in the cafe, and he was aware that he was still learning how to see the world, but he also understood that he was headed in the correct direction. From a different perspective, one that was more understanding and sympathetic, he wasn't flawless, but he was making an effort, and that alone was sufficient. And while they sat in cozy stillness, the burden of as the previous few months seemed to settle in around them, Mark began to realize that real change didn't come from big gestures. It took the form of tiny, deliberate acts of compassion and understanding. It occurred when people listened to each other, understood, and saw each other for who they really were. Keanu stood up and stretched a little, saying, "It's a beautiful day." Gazing out into the park, "Perhaps you ought to write about how sometimes the most significant transformation begins with simply sitting next to someone and listening." Mark grinned and got to his feet. He responded, "Perhaps I will," as they strolled through the. After learning so much in such a short period of time, Mark couldn't help but feel at peace, something he had never experienced before. However, the most important lesson was that compassion was the common thread that bound everything together.